She flinched when the dog's nose brushed her wrist. The hound was enormous, its fur matted with dust, its ears flicking as it sniffed her hands. She had frozen, heart pounding, lips trembling. "Don't bite me," she whispered in Japanese. But the fear in her eyes spoke a universal language. The American cowboy who held the leash didn't understand the words, but he understood the look. He raised a hand to calm her, but before he could speak, the dog did something unexpected. It sat. Then it nudged her palm with its head, whined softly, and licked her fingers. The Japanese nurse, captured in the jungles of Luzon, caked in dried blood, told all her life that Americans would treat her worse than an animal, began to cry. Not from fear, from the unbearable kindness of a creature she had been taught to fear. She'd seen soldiers shoot the wounded, bury prisoners alive, beat men for less than a cough. But a dog, here, on enemy soil, had just offered her peace. The girl was barely 20, but her eyes held a 1,000-yard stare carved by months of mud, fever, and death. Her uniform, what was left of it, hung off her thin frame like loose bandages. The cloth was stained with dried blood that was not all her own, and her hands bore the tremble of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. She had trained as a military nurse in Hiroshima, but when the Americans landed in the Philippines, she was transferred to Luzon. There, deep in the jungle, the war had unraveled. Food ran out, orders became panicked shouts, and women like her were told only one thing: don't be captured. "The shame," her superior whispered through cracked lips, "will be worse than death." When the surrender order came, her knees had buckled, not from relief, but from confusion. She hadn't prepared to survive. They were loaded onto trucks, eyes blindfolded, and driven through terrain that smelled like rot and rain. She didn't speak for the entire ride, and when they crossed into American lines, her breath caught in her throat. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. No screaming, no guns pressed to her back, no hands tearing at her. The first words she heard were spoken softly, an American voice, unintelligible in language, but curiously gentle in tone. She had been taught otherwise. The military instructors had not minced words during training. The Americans are not human. They keep dogs trained to smell weakness, to bite without command. They throw prisoners into pits and watch for sport. In one lesson, an officer unrolled a photo, allegedly of a Chinese soldier mauled by American canines, and told the women, "This is what awaits you if you fail." Another told them that Americans didn't even bury their captives. They just fed them to animals. Some of the girls believed it, others didn't. But they all memorized the lesson. If captured, hide your face. Never beg. And if a dog approaches, do not run. It only makes the bite worse. Now she stood on American soil in a strange flatland under an endless sky, her boots caked in dust, the sun glaring against her shoulders. The Texas heat pressed against her like a second skin. The air didn't reek of cordite or death. It smelled like grass, smoke, and something else. Meat. Cooking meat. Her stomach turned on itself. She hadn't tasted meat in weeks. They had boiled weeds in the jungle and sometimes shoe leather. She felt herself sway. Then she saw it. A man in worn jeans, wide-brimmed hat, a rolled-up shirt with sleeves revealing sun-darkened arms. Not a soldier, she realized, but something else entirely. He stood near the entrance gate of the camp, leaning casually on a wooden post, and beside him sat the dog. It was enormous, brown and black with a streak of white down its chest, tongue lolling, tail swishing against the dirt. It looked directly at her, and her entire body locked. Her lips parted before she could stop them, and the words came out in a whisper, "Don't bite me." But the dog didn't move. The man, the cowboy, raised an eyebrow, tilted his head as if trying to understand. He murmured something to the dog, who took a single step forward, nose twitching. The girl froze, eyes wide. Her knees threatened to give. The dog padded closer, stopped, and sniffed her shoes. Then sat. She blinked. The wind lifted her hair, and the dog, casually, without warning, pressed its wet nose against her wrist and licked her fingers. It was the softest thing she had felt in months. The tears that came had nothing to do with pain. The cowboy shifted his weight and scratched his neck, as if unsure what to do with the sight before him. He hadn't meant to startle her. When Red licked the girl's fingers, it hadn't been a command. The hound had simply acted on instinct, calm, unhurried, gentle in a way few expected from a dog that size. Red had always been that way. He was a cattle dog, not a soldier's beast, raised among wind and dust, trained to guide, not chase. He knew the difference between menace and fear, and this woman, slight and shaking in her tattered uniform, posed no threat. She smelled of blood and salt and something else, something hollow. Red had sensed it and responded the only way he knew how. The girl hadn't expected kindness. Her eyes darted between the dog and the cowboy, her whole body taut as a snare. She waited for the trick, for the bite, for the bark that would send her into panic. But none came. Red just sat there, tail slow against the dirt, watching her with that open, panting patience only dogs seem capable of. Back home, dogs were tools of terror. In training camps, the instructors showed them images, gruesome, grainy photos of corpses torn apart by canines, eyes blank, limbs chewed. They told them how American forces used dogs to chase down deserters, tear into soft flesh, sniff out the wounded like prey. One officer had smiled when he said, "Their dogs don't bark, they only bite." The girls had swallowed the fear whole. Even as they marched through the jungle, the growl of any dog, stray or not, sent shivers down their spines. And now, here she was, being licked by one. She couldn't stop staring. Red's ears twitched, catching the wind, and he let out a small yawn, utterly at ease. Her hand remained suspended in the air, fingers curled slightly, as if unsure whether to return the gesture. When she finally moved, just a flick of the wrist to brush the fur on his head, Red leaned into it. That's when it broke. A sob cracked out of her like a shot, sharp and sudden. She turned her face, hiding behind one bruised hand, but the sound echoed. The cowboy stepped forward, alarmed at first, but stopped when Red stayed seated. No growl, no movement, just that quiet, unshakable stillness. The girl slid to her knees, the dust of Texas clinging to her. Her shoulders shook. The fear that had been carved into her back with every command, every whispered warning, every sleepless night. It had nowhere to go. It couldn't stand in the presence of this quiet, panting creature. She had expected pain, expected to be treated like livestock, expected to be broken. Instead, she had been met by a dog who acted as if she were something worth comforting. Around them, the yard was still. Other prisoners stood watching, eyes wide, uncertain. A few whispered. One of the guards leaned on his rifle, mouth slightly open. The cowboy didn't say anything. He crouched slowly, tipped his hat back, and looked at the girl. "He likes you," he said. Of course she didn't understand the words, but the tone, the gentle cadence, was unmistakable. For the first time in weeks, the girl exhaled, fully. Her hands dropped to her lap, and her eyes met Red's. And for a moment, she didn't feel like a prisoner. That night, she lay on a real bed. Not bamboo slats or a patch of mud, not a corner of floor beneath a leaking tarp, but a wooden frame, a thin mattress, and a blanket that smelled faintly of soap and starch. The window near her cot was cracked slightly open, and through it she could smell something that didn't belong in war. Bread. Warm, yeasty, soft. Not ration biscuits, not bark-stretched rice. Actual bread. Outside, the sky was impossibly wide, stars scattered in unfamiliar patterns. There were no searchlights, no distant booms of artillery, no shouted orders, just a low murmur of guards' voices and the occasional clink of utensils from the mess hall's rear. She lay on her back, hands folded over her stomach, listening. The silence unnerved her more than gunfire ever had. Peace, after so much chaos, was not a comfort. It was a question. In the morning, the question deepened. She rose with the others at the sound of a soft bell. No screaming, no canes slapping against walls, just the quiet insistence of routine. They were led to the mess hall where steam curled from enormous metal trays. The scent hit her like a wave. Eggs, potatoes, some kind of stew. She blinked. Her stomach reacted before her brain could catch up. She barely noticed Red until she'd stepped out into the yard later that day. He was lying beneath a patch of shade, his head resting on his front paws, eyes half-lidded. Another prisoner, a woman perhaps 5 years older, with short-cut hair and a scab on her chin, was kneeling beside him. What happened next shattered something inside her. The woman clapped once, and Red lifted his head. She pointed a finger. "Sit," she said in thick, uncertain English. Red blinked, tail wagged. She tried again. "Sit." Her voice was playful, teasing. Red rose, circled once, then sat, tongue lolling. The woman laughed. It was a short burst of sound, startled and bright, and it cut through the air like lightning. The girl stiffened. Laughter. Here? In uniform? In front of guards? She waited for the blow, the reprimand, the officer's bark. But nothing came, no one yelled, no hand was raised. The woman reached out and rubbed behind Red's ears, and Red leaned into it, groaning happily. The girl felt her knees go weak. She turned away, because laughter like that, open, unguarded, was not just unfamiliar. It was dangerous. Back home, laughter was for celebration days, for permitted rituals. During the war, it was rationed like everything else. Officers had told them laughter dulled the warrior's edge. To smile too easily was a sign of softness. To laugh out loud? Reckless. And yet here it was, offered not as rebellion, but as something far stranger, permission. That night she lay awake again. The stars were still out, the bed still warm, her stomach full from food she hadn't begged for, and her thoughts would not quiet. She had survived the jungle, she had survived capture, but this quiet, this kindness, this absurd, ordinary laughter was beginning to undo her. She wasn't sure if it was safety or the slow beginning of something else, something terrifying, freedom. Freedom, after all, was not just about open gates. It was the collapse of old certainties. And behind the chain-link fences of the Texas camp, even with guards watching and schedules rigid, she began to feel something unfamiliar press into her chest. Not fear, not dread, but confusion. Confusion about what the war had meant. Confusion about why she was still alive. And then came the dreams. They didn't come at night. Not really. At night she was too exhausted to dream. They came in the pauses, the quiet moments between meals and work detail. She would be folding laundry or cleaning medical cots, and suddenly the smell of bleach would drag her backward, into the stench of blood and gangrene. She remembered the retreat, how the field hospital had broken like glass. The tarps tore in the monsoon winds. There were no more bandages, no morphine, The wounded screamed for water, for mercy, for their mothers. Some had legs half gone, some no eyes. One man had clutched her arm so tightly that his fingernails broke her skin. She hadn't felt it. Not then. Not after the third straight day without sleep. Not after the final doctor had vanished into the trees. She'd stopped feeling that week. Not because she was brave, but because feeling anything would have shattered her. One woman, a nurse from Osaka, cracked under the weight. She ran screaming into the trees during a bombing run and was never seen again. The girl had watched her disappear without saying a word. It was during that collapse that her commanding officer, Lieutenant Sakai, gathered the remaining women in the dark and gave his final speech. "We do not surrender," he told them. His voice was brittle with fever. "We do not become prisoners. Death is purity. To live as a captive is to betray the emperor, the nation, your ancestors." Then he left, took a pistol and disappeared into the jungle. They were 27 women. No one came back for them. The hunger came first, hollow and deep, then the fever. One girl cut her palm trying to open a can with a rock, and the wound festered into rot. They buried her in a shallow grave using their hands. She had been 17. Now, every time someone handed her a tray of food or offered her water, she felt the ache of those who hadn't made it. And every time Red padded into view, tail low, ears perked, her body flinched. Not because she feared him, but because she didn't know how to accept the absence of violence. The hound was too gentle. It unmoored her. Men could be complicated, even enemies. She could rationalize the kindness of a soldier. Maybe he had orders. Maybe he needed something from her. But the dog had no motive. He wanted nothing. He simply came and sat beside her, resting his warm weight against her legs. She once whispered to him when no one was listening, told him the names of the women who didn't survive, of Lieutenant Sakai and the shallow grave in the jungle. Red had just blinked at her and nudged her hand. It felt like confession. In the war she'd come from, emotions were dangerous. Comfort was weakness. And yet now, with a dog's head resting on her lap, she found herself longing for softness, and it terrified her more than the jungle ever had. In the weeks that followed, she found herself moving differently through the camp. Slower, less like a hunted thing, and more like someone testing the edges of new ground. Each morning, after roll call and breakfast, she scanned the yard for him. The guards changed, the schedules shifted, but Red remained a constant. If she saw him trotting along beside the cowboy, tongue flopping, ears perked, she felt her shoulders loosen. If Red was near, she would not be struck. If Red was nearby, she would not be mocked, dragged, shamed. She started volunteering for kitchen duty, not because she loved scrubbing pots or slicing potatoes, but because Red sometimes lay near the side of the mess hall, curled in the shade with his nose tucked against his belly. When no one was looking, she would crouch and press her palm to his back. He never pulled away. Sometimes, if she was lucky, he would raise his head and let her scratch behind his ear. At first she did it in secret, a flick of the fingers, a glance over her shoulder. But even that small contact made her heart slow. She didn't know how to explain it, not even to herself. Red made her feel safe, yes, but he also made her feel seen, not as a prisoner, not as a number, but as a person. The cowboy began to notice. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his words came slow, easy, and wrapped in an accent she didn't understand. But there was kindness in the way he looked at her. Not pity, not curiosity, just quiet understanding. He started nodding when she passed, sometimes tipping his hat in that strange American way. Once, when she dropped a ladle near the kitchen door and flinched as it clattered, he bent down, picked it up, and handed it to her without a word. She nodded, eyes low, and he smiled just a little, then pointed to Red and said, "He likes you. Keeps waitin' by the door like he knows you're comin'." She didn't catch the meaning, not entirely, but she heard her name in his voice. Not her real name, but what he called her, Red's girl. Red's girl. She carried the words like a secret. Something strange began to happen after that. The other prisoners noticed, too, that Red always wagged his tail when she came near, that he followed her with his eyes. Some joked about it in hushed Japanese, others said nothing at all. One day an older woman gently pushed her forward when Red padded up during break time. "Go on," she whispered. "He's waiting for you." It was the dog, she realized, who had made all this possible. No translator, no classroom, no speeches or slow English lessons, just a tail thumping in the dust, a pair of brown eyes, a warmth pressed against her knees. Red became the only part of the camp that didn't feel foreign. He didn't care where she was born or what uniform she had worn. He had no questions, no conditions. And that was what trust began to feel like. Not grand, not sudden, just the quiet certainty that someone, even if it was just a dog, would not hurt you. And for a girl raised in the ruins of war, that was nothing short of revolutionary. The guard placed them on the table with the same indifference he showed when handing out bowls of stew, but to her the gesture struck like lightning. A whole, uncreased sheet of paper, smoother than any she had touched during the war, and a pencil worn soft from another hand's grip. Writing material had been rare even in Japan. In the jungle it had been a luxury bordering on fantasy. She stared at the items as if they were a trap. Around her, other women whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking nervously toward the guards as if expecting the offer to be snatched away. The Americans told them the letters would be checked before sending, but they would try to deliver them. She had no idea what that meant. The mistrust drilled into her from childhood murmured its warnings. Nothing given is ever free, nothing written is ever safe. Even so, she lifted the pencil, feeling its weight settle into her fingers. The blank page seemed impossibly wide, impossibly bright. She tried to begin with something simple. "Mother, I am alive." But the words looked wrong, too soft for the jagged truth of her days. She erased it, smearing the graphite with the heel of her hand. She tried again. "The Americans treat us better than we expected." That felt more dangerous, or perhaps more painful. She scratched it out, too. Each sentence she attempted felt like it had to choose between pride, shame, loyalty, and betrayal, and she could not yet tell which of those she was allowed to feel. Part of her remembered the starvation back home, the sirens, the nights spent hiding from firestorms. What right did she have to write about stew and clean blankets when her family might be digging through rubble for water? Another part of her, smaller, quieter, wanted desperately to tell the truth, that she had expected cruelty, and instead found a dog who looked at her with gentle eyes, that the people she had been taught to fear had treated her with a kind of steady, bewildering humanity. But what could she write that wouldn't sound like madness to the world she had come from? Her mind spun until she set the pencil down and closed her eyes, letting her breath settle. She thought of Red, of the way he had nudged her hand, offering a softness she had almost forgotten existed. He had asked nothing from her. He had known nothing of uniforms or surrender. And suddenly the first words of her letter arrived not in her mind, but in her chest. She picked up the pencil and wrote, "Mother, I was afraid of a dog." The line shocked her, and for a moment she almost laughed at how childish it sounded. But she kept writing. "He licked my hand." Her breath steadied. There was no pride in that sentence, no politics, just truth, simple and unadorned, and it was the simplicity of it that made her hand tremble. I am alive. When she finished, she stared at the page for a long moment, tracing the letters with her fingertip as though they might dissolve if she blinked. It wasn't a report. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't even an apology. It was simply the truth of her life at that moment, a truth she had not been able to speak aloud, even to herself. She folded the letter with deliberate care, pressing the crease flat. Whether a censor threw it away, whether her mother ever saw it, whether it traveled halfway across the world or no farther than the guardhouse, none of that mattered. What mattered was that she had written it at all. For the first time in her life, she had allowed herself to speak without fear, without orders, without the weight of someone else's story on her shoulders. It was the first message she had ever sent that belonged entirely to her, even if it never left her hands. And then, one morning, that voice was tested in an entirely new way. It happened without announcement, without explanation. The sun was barely above the horizon, the yard still empty except for a few guards sipping coffee. She was wiping down the benches outside the mess hall when she saw them, the cowboy in red. The hound trotted ahead as always, tail swinging like a metronome, but something was different. The cowboy wasn't holding the leash. He walked toward her, boots kicking up dust, and stopped just a few feet away. For a second he looked at her, then at Red, then held out the worn leather loop. She froze. Her hands, chapped and stained from weeks of labor, hovered uncertainly. The leash looked heavier than it was, as if it carried weight not visible to the eye. The cowboy didn't say a word, just nodded once and pressed it gently into her palm. The moment the leather touched her skin, the world seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't about control. It wasn't even about privilege. It was about trust. The man was handing her something precious, not just the leash, but the care of a creature that moved freely, that wasn't bound to duty or punishment. She wasn't being asked to clean. She wasn't being ordered to work. She was being offered responsibility. Red looked up at her, his eyes soft, as if to say, "It's all right. I know you." She didn't know how long she stood there before her legs finally remembered how to move. Slowly, one step at a time, she began to walk. Red trotted beside her, loose and relaxed, tongue out. At first, she didn't notice the other prisoners watching, but as she turned along the perimeter of the yard, she caught them in her peripheral vision. Women standing still mid-task, jaws slightly open. One woman dropped her broom, another whispered to the girl beside her and pointed. Half awe, half disbelief. A few smiled, a few looked uneasy. The leash in her hand wasn't just a strip of leather, it was a symbol. She kept walking, eyes forward, back straight. Each step sent a ripple through the camp, but inside her chest, something strange stirred. Pride. Not the kind drilled into her by slogans and superiors. This was quieter, older, personal. Red glanced up occasionally as if checking on her. She squeezed the leash gently and kept moving. Her mind flicked to a voice she thought she'd buried. "A woman is nothing but a tool." Her last commander, his uniform spotless, even as the hospital collapsed. He'd said it in front of them all, dismissing a girl who dared to cry after a patient died. A tool serves, not thinks. A tool obeys. But here she was, walking a dog in a foreign land, without orders, without fear. She wasn't serving. She was choosing. That, more than anything, shook her. By the time she returned the leash, her hand had stopped trembling. The cowboy took it back without a word. But his nod held meaning. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was more than what the war had told her she was, and every step with that leash had proven it. It happened just after lunch, during cleanup duty in the kitchen. The Texas heat had turned the metal walls of the mess hall into an oven, and the stoves inside pulsed with heat. She had her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, scrubbing the underside of a heavy pot. That's when she noticed the silence, not outside, but within. The normal hum of the burners was gone, replaced by a low hiss. She didn't know what it meant. She paused, looked up. Then Red's bark split the air. It came from outside, but it sounded closer, fiercer. Not his usual greeting or lazy huff. This was an alarm. Within seconds, boots clattered across the concrete, and a guard burst into the room. His eyes locked on the stove nearest the back wall. A second later, he was shouting, cutting power, dragging the girls back. One of the gas lines had slipped. A leak. Had Red not barked, no one would have noticed until it was too late. There was no explosion, no flames, just a moment where everything could have gone wrong, and didn't. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from something else. The awareness that she was still breathing because of a dog, a creature she'd once thought was trained to kill. The barracks were quiet, a soft rustle of bodies and breathing. Then she heard a whisper at the door. It creaked open. A figure slipped inside. A young girl, maybe 15, maybe 16, with short hair and nimble hands. She clutched something wrapped in a towel. The girl knelt beside her cot and whispered, "For you." She blinked, unsure. The girl pulled back the towel and revealed a small blanket, crudely stitched but warm-looking, faded fabric patched together, mismatched threads crisscrossing the seams. And in one corner, sewn in clumsy but loving stitches, was the shape of a paw print. "I think he likes you," the girl said. Then she was gone. She sat there, blanket in hand, unsure whether to cry or laugh or bury her face in it and disappear. She ran her fingers over the uneven threads. Someone had made this, not because they were told to, not for reward, but because affection, simple, generous affection, still existed in a place built on fences and rules. She lay down with the blanket over her chest, the paw print resting just above her heart. And in that quiet moment, something clicked inside her. Safety, she realized, wasn't about obedience. It wasn't about following orders or being small enough not to be noticed. Safety was something else entirely. It was someone barking when danger came close. It was a hand offering cloth under cover of night. It was a cowboy placing a leash in yours, not to bind you, but to trust you. It wasn't fear that kept her alive now. It was care. It was the slow, strange bloom of being seen. If you've made it this far and you're enjoying the story, like the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing your thoughts. The announcement came on a dry, yellow-skied afternoon, not with fanfare or flags, but a chalkboard scrawled in English and Japanese. "The war is over. Japan has surrendered." The yard fell silent. Some women gasped, some wept. A few simply sat down where they stood. She did nothing, not at first, not because she didn't understand, but because she didn't know how to feel. Return, repatriation, home. These were words that had lost their meaning in the years of marching, bleeding, obeying. Now they were being handed back to her as if they still fit. Guards said a transport would arrive in 1 week, 7 days. She and the others would be sent by train, then ship, back across the ocean, back to a place she had not seen since she was a girl in braids and sandals. But Red would not be coming. The cowboy told her softly. His words were slow, careful, his face kind. "Camp closes next month," he said. "He stays with me." She nodded once and then turned away. For 2 days she avoided Red entirely. She hid in the laundry tent. She volunteered for latrine duty. When she walked the yard, she kept her eyes fixed on the dirt. Not because she was angry, but because she was afraid of what goodbye might undo. If she touched him again, if she met his gaze, she didn't know if she'd be able to leave. What frightened her most wasn't going home. It was the possibility that this sliver of peace, of identity, of small kindnesses, might vanish the moment she stepped on that boat. And so she tried to fade. But Red, as ever, saw her. On the 6th night, just after dusk, she slipped behind the barracks and crawled beneath the wooden steps. It was a place the guards never checked, where moonlight couldn't reach, and the world felt quiet enough to breathe. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms around the blanket with the stitched paw print, and tried not to feel the ache blooming beneath her ribs. Then came the sound, soft paws, familiar breath, a nose nudging her arm. Red had found her. He didn't bark, he didn't whine. He just crawled in beside her, tail thumping once, then resting still. She didn't speak. Her hands moved before her thoughts did. She pressed her forehead to his and closed her eyes. Then, with a breath she didn't know she'd been holding, she leaned forward and licked his head. It was instinct, not human, not dog, just something ancient and pure and wordless. A gesture from one creature to another. I see you. I thank you. I carry you with me. Red licked her back. Once. Then he settled against her side, warm and unbothered. She didn't cry. Not then. She simply breathed, heart steady, knowing this moment, this dog, this night, was real. And nothing, not even the ocean waiting to swallow her, could take it away. The years came in quiet waves. When she returned to Japan, the land was not the one she'd left behind. Osaka stood scarred and scorched, buildings she'd once passed in childhood reduced to charcoal bones. But somehow, amid rubble and silence, life resumed. She found work washing linens in a clinic, then assisting a traveling midwife. Eventually, she opened a narrow apothecary tucked between two rebuilt storefronts, where neighbors asked her about headaches, stubborn colds, and how to sleep through the night. Through it all, she kept her story folded up like a letter never sent. She rarely spoke of the camp, not because the memories were buried too deep, but because they had become too sacred to unwrap in casual conversation. People asked, now and then, what was it like? And she would only say, with a faint smile, there were hard days, but I learned many things. No one asked what she had learned. No one could imagine that the truest answer might involve a dog, until one rainy spring afternoon, when her granddaughter found the photograph. The girl had been helping her organize an old chest of belongings when she pulled out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside, pressed flat and faded with age, was a black and white photograph. A girl stood barefoot in sun-bleached dust, holding the leash of a large hound. Both looked toward the camera, but the girl's eyes were tilted down, caught in the middle of a glance at the animal beside her. "Who's this?" the child asked, brushing dust from the corners. She sat down slowly, knees stiff, and took the photo in both hands. "That," she said with a soft breath, "is me." "And the dog?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she turned to the drawer of her old writing desk and opened it, her fingers moving instinctively to the far back. From behind a stack of yellowed postcards, she withdrew an envelope, thin, brittle, sealed but never sent. "I wrote this the night before we left the camp," she said, her voice steady. "But I never mailed it." The girl nodded, eyes wide, and watched as she carefully unfolded the letter. The paper crackled with age, but the words remained clear. She began to read aloud. "Dear Red, Tomorrow I leave. They say we will go by train, then boat. I don't know where the boat will stop. Maybe I will vanish again. Maybe this time it won't hurt so much. I want to say thank you. Not for saving me from the stove, not for walking beside me, but for something stranger. You believed I was good before I did. When I first met you, I said, "Don't bite me." I thought that's what dogs did. I thought that's what Americans trained you to do. But you didn't. You licked my hand. I don't think you knew what that meant. But I did. It meant I was still human, still worth something. You didn't speak my language, Red, but you taught me how to trust. Goodbye, boy. Please remember me, if dogs remember things like that. The paper trembled slightly in her grip. She folded it once more, setting it gently in her lap. Her granddaughter sat still, brow furrowed in thought. "Did he remember you?" she asked. She didn't smile. Not this time. Instead, her eyes drifted to the window, to the sound of rain ticking gently against the glass. "I like to think so," she said. Another quiet moment passed. Was he just a dog? She looked down at her granddaughter, then at the old letter resting atop her knees. "No," she said. "He wasn't just a dog." Her voice lowered, the memory blooming like warmth inside her chest. "He was the first time I was treated like I mattered." And this time she let the silence linger. She had said everything that needed to be said. If this story moved you, give it a thumbs up and leave a comment with where you're watching from. Let us know if you want more stories like this one.